April 1941. The Libyan desert outside Tobruk shimmered under the sun as German armor rolled forward in long, confident lines. From his command position, General Erwin Rommel observed his panzers advancing toward the Australian perimeter. This was supposed to be a straightforward breakthrough. Speed, shock, and steel would do what they had done everywhere else. By nightfall, the desert told a different story. 17 of the 38 tanks committed to the assault were burning, disabled, or abandoned. The attack stalled, then collapsed. No single weapon had stopped Rommel's armor. There was no miracle gun, no secret superweapon. What shattered the assault was something far more dangerous, a carefully layered defense. Minefields tore open tracks. 2-pounder anti-tank guns picked off targets at range. Artillery fired directly into advancing vehicles. Infantry waited silently for the tanks that slipped through. And among those infantry were teams carrying a weapon many experts had already dismissed as useless. It weighed nearly 36 pounds. It fed from a 5-round magazine mounted awkwardly on top. Military planners across Europe had written it off as incapable of stopping modern tanks. Yet in the chaos around Tobruk, this rifle mattered. Not because it could kill a panzer head-on, but because it could kill everything that allowed panzers to fight. And that distinction changed battles. A problem that would not go away. Throughout the 1930s, British military planners faced an uncomfortable reality. Tanks were evolving faster than infantry weapons. Armor was thickening. Speeds were increasing. Infantry units, the backbone of the army, were being left exposed. A soldier watching a tank approach had only two real choices: run or die. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, expensive, and difficult to deploy in sufficient numbers. The War Office wanted something different. A weapon a single infantry section could carry. Something cheap enough to issue widely. Something capable of damaging armor at realistic battlefield distances. In October 1934, that challenge landed on the desk of Captain Henry Charles Boys at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield. The project was classified under the deliberately bland codename Stanchion. Boys approached the problem with brutal honesty. Armor penetration came down to physics. To punch through steel, you needed velocity. To generate velocity from a man-portable weapon, you needed a carefully balanced cartridge, powerful enough to do the job, but not so powerful it shattered the firer. His answer was extreme. A .55-inch caliber round, measuring 13.9 millimeters. Massive by rifle standards. The early Mark I ammunition launched a 60-gram projectile at roughly 747 meters per second. Later improvements led to the Mark II round, which fired a lighter 47-gram bullet at nearly 884 meters per second. The numbers looked promising on paper. Reality was less forgiving. At 100 yards, the rifle could penetrate around 23 millimeters of armor, if the impact was perfectly perpendicular. At 500 yards, penetration dropped to roughly 19 millimeters. Any angle at all reduced effectiveness dramatically. That meant the rifle could defeat light armor. It could not defeat modern medium tanks. The problem was obvious almost immediately. A weapon born too late. The rifle that emerged from Enfield was enormous. Over 63 inches long, fitted with a massive muzzle brake to tame recoil and a padded shoulder rest to save the shooter's collarbone. Even so, it was brutal to fire. A two-man team was almost mandatory for moving and operating it effectively. Captain Boys never lived to see his creation enter service. He died in November 1937, just days before the War Office formally adopted the weapon. In his honor, it was named the Boys anti-tank rifle, though German intelligence consistently misspelled it as Boys throughout the war. Production ramped up quickly. Birmingham Small Arms, Enfield, and factories in Canada turned them out by the tens of thousands. By the time production ended in late 1943, roughly 62,000 rifles had been built. It was a staggering investment in a weapon already drifting toward irrelevance. Critics wasted no time pointing that out. By the outbreak of war, German tanks were already pushing beyond the rifle's capabilities. Against Panzer III and IV variants entering service from 1941 onward, frontal armor was simply too thick. 50 millimeters of steel laughed at a rifle round, no matter how fast it traveled. British soldiers learned this lesson the hard way. One sergeant from the King's Royal Rifle Corps later described firing at a German tank at barely 50 yards during the fighting in France. The shot struck cleanly. The impact stripped paint and left a mark. The tank never slowed. The sergeant dropped the rifle and ran. By every conventional measure, the boys was obsolete. But that verdict assumed every armored vehicle on the battlefield was a Panzer III. They were not. The wrong targets. Calling the boys' rifle useless depended entirely on what one expected it to fight. In North Africa, German units operated alongside Italian formations whose equipment reflected an earlier era. Italian L3 tankettes carried armor as thin as 6 to 14 millimeters, well within the rifle's capabilities. Armored cars, troop carriers, and reconnaissance vehicles were similarly vulnerable. Even heavier Italian tanks like the M1340 could resist frontal hits, but their flanks, tracks, optics, and running gear remained exposed. Beyond tanks lay something even more important. Logistics. Fuel trucks. Ammunition carriers. Staff cars. Communications vehicles. Armored cars like the German SD Kfz 222, protected by as little as 8 millimeters of steel. The boy's rifle could destroy all of them. And it could do so from positions anti-tank guns could never reach. Modern armies do not run on tanks alone. They run on fuel, spare parts, and information. Disable those, and armor becomes irrelevant. This reality revealed itself almost immediately. Early proof. The rifle earned its first real reputation far from the desert. In April 1940, during the fighting in Norway, Platoon Sergeant Major John Shepherd of the 1SD 5th Leicestershire Regiment faced advancing German armor near the village of Tretton. According to multiple accounts, Shepherd had never fired a boy's rifle before that day. It did not matter. Working deliberately, he placed repeated armor-piercing rounds into each approaching tank. 2 were disabled outright. The remaining vehicles withdrew. It was among the earliest documented instances of British infantry destroying German tanks in the war. Weeks later, in France, Sergeant William Gilchrist of the Irish Guards held a street corner in Boulogne for nearly 2 hours using nothing but a boy's rifle. His official citation records that he disabled and set fire to an enemy tank, blocking the street and allowing his battalion to withdraw. He remained in position until the rifle finally jammed from sustained firing. These were not accidents. They were demonstrations of a weapon being used intelligently. Operation Compass. Before Rommel ever reached Tobruk, British and Commonwealth forces had already learned how to exploit the rifle's strengths. During Operation Compass in December 1940, Indian and British units engaged Italian formations across Egypt and Libya. Records from the 4/6 Rajatana rifles and the 1st Northumberland Fusiliers document multiple Italian tanks and trucks destroyed by boys' rifle fire at Nabewa and Tuma East. One account describes 5 Italian CV tankettes knocked out in a single engagement. Australian units recorded similar results. Private O'Neill reportedly destroyed 3 Italian tanks with his rifle, an achievement that stunned even his own comrades, given the weapon's growing reputation as a failure. The pattern was clear. Against the right targets, the rifle worked. Tobruk, a system, not a miracle. By the time Rommel launched his April 1941 assault on Tobruk, the defenders understood something German planners underestimated. Anti-tank warfare was not about a single weapon. It was about systems. General Leslie Morshead organized the Australian defence into layered zones. The outer perimeter absorbed the initial shock. Infantry stayed hidden while tanks rolled through. As German infantry followed, defenders emerged to engage them at close range. Behind them waited the real tank killers, 2-pounder anti-tank guns and 25-pounder artillery firing over open sights. Threaded throughout this system were boys' rifle teams. Their role was precise. They targeted armored cars probing for weak points. They disabled supply vehicles. They attacked reconnaissance elements before they could report gaps. They engaged light armor the larger guns did not waste ammunition on. On April 14th, Rommel expected a breakthrough in hours. Instead, his assault bled itself dry. 17 tanks were lost. The attack was called off. The boy's rifle did not stop the panzers alone. But without it, the system would have had holes. Hated by the men who carried it. None of this made the rifle popular. Soldiers despised firing it. Australians nicknamed it Charlie the Bastard. The recoil was savage. Neck injuries, bruised shoulders, and even detached retinas were reported despite the padding and muzzle brake. The blast was so intense that men were advised to protect their hearing whenever possible. Jokes circulated that firing the double nickel should automatically qualify a man for the Victoria Cross. The Canadian government even commissioned a Disney-produced training film in 1942 to counter the weapon's reputation as cursed or jinxed. It was not loved, but it was used. The Pacific Surprise. The rifle's final validation came nowhere near Europe. In August 1942, during the fighting at Milne Bay in Papua, Australian forces encountered Japanese Type 95 Hargo tanks. These vehicles carried armor between 6 and 12 millimeters thick. Perfect targets. Corporal John Francis Patrick O'Brien of the 210th Infantry Battalion engaged a Type 95 with his boy's rifle, punching multiple holes through its armor. That tank survives today at the Australian War Memorial, its penetration still visible. Days earlier, U.S. Marine raiders on Markin Island borrowed Canadian-made boys' rifles during their raid. Japanese seaplanes attempting to reinforce the garrison were engaged from shore. One aircraft burst into flames. The second crashed while trying to take off. The anti-tank rifle had just performed anti-aircraft work. So much for useless. The irony of obsolescence. Germany's own equivalent weapon, the Panzerbuchse 39, actually outperformed the boys, with penetration closer to 30 millimeters. Yet German production ceased in late 1941. Both sides recognized anti-tank rifles could not defeat modern tanks. Only Britain continued finding ways to use what it already had. By mid-1943, the boys was withdrawn from frontline service, replaced by the PIAT. But its impact lingered. 62,000 rifles meant 62,000 positions where infantry could engage armored targets without waiting for guns. In the desert, that meant supply columns destroyed. Recon units disrupted. Light armor neutralized. The rifle designed to stop tanks rarely stopped tanks. It stopped wars from working smoothly. What Tobruk taught. Tobruk taught German commanders something uncomfortable. British forces would not fight on German terms. They would combine old weapons with new ones. They would exploit every weakness. They would turn obsolete tools into force multipliers. The boys' rifle did not win battles. It filled gaps. It engaged targets heavier weapons ignored. It punished assumptions. It reminded armored commanders that steel alone does not guarantee victory. Obsolete is a word for peacetime. In combat, there is only what works, and what doesn't. The boys' anti-tank rifle worked. Not always how it was intended, but always where it mattered.